I'm on staff with the Clark Fork Pend Oreille Coalition, and with me today is Toni Matlock Taylor. She's a local multimedia artist. She was trained at the Art Institute of Chicago and has her master's from the University of Washington. We don't have a big crowd here, but actually I'd kind of like to see people move up so it's a little bit more intimate. I mean, it's just a few of us here. And another thing I'd like to say is that throughout the presentation, if you have questions, be sure to just ask them as we go. We'd like to make this as close to suiting your interests and needs as we can and make it interactive. Basically, what we're going to be talking to you about today is paper and paper making and all of the different fibers and issues that come up with that, including environmental consequences. So I'm going to turn it over to Toni, who's going to give the first presentation.
Well, first of all, I want to give you a historic perspective on paper, addressing some of the cultural impacts throughout the world that paper has had. I'll go over the process, handmade as well as industrial, in order to help us understand the significant relationship between water and paper and the serious problems confronted with bleaching paper. So before paper, records were kept on bamboo, silk, stone, animal skin, and materials like that. So paper was very important in that it not only was it cheaper, but it made printing easier, which made producing in quantity possible. And getting information out in quantity was an enormous improvement. You can't listen. We need to know mic. Really? All right. Is this for that? Can people hear the bass pretty well? Okay. It's yeah. Actually, we just said that. All right. So, the oldest paper maker known to man has been paper making for 1 million years. And that's the wasp. And then the first human credited with paper making is by a man named Sai Lun. I hope I pronounced that correctly, but it was a Chinaman in AD 105. And his task was to find an alternative to silk and bamboo for writing. The Chinese would continue to develop paper, bringing us paper books, the first paper money, as well as toilet paper. And they kept the knowledge of paper and making paper a very good secret for a very long time. It eventually did reach more of the East, including Japan. And as it spread through the Arab world, gradually, it didn't reach Italy and Europe until 1,000 years later. And by the 12th century, Europe was addressing paper, and it led to the information revolution, with the 15th century coming with the Gutenberg press, which would make printing that paper in enormous quantity possible. So up to this point, paper was being made with primarily hemp, linen, and cotton rags in Western culture. So continuing on through history, in the 1700s, there was a Frenchman who was studying the wasp, and he suggested wood pulp as an alternative to the other sources that we were using, but nobody acted on it just yet. Then in 1774, the bleaching process was invented and developed by a German man. So these things happened, but it wasn't until the 19th century that the demand for paper was so enormous that people turned to tree pulp because of its cheapness and its abundance. So those factors, the bleaching and the wood pulp, would result in today's industrial conundrum, if you will. So thinking about paper and its importance and seeing it as its purposes, it's a medium of communication. It's used for media, print media, correspondence, creative and religious expression, documentation, records, memorabilia, and then its creative functions, decoration on through the fine arts, all the way up to paper making being an art form in and of itself. Then Another fascinating quality to paper is its role in commemoration. Celebration banners, wrappings, up to certain cultures using paper in their rituals and in ceremonial garments and objects. In Mexico, there is, during the celebration of the Day of the Dead, as well as other holidays, there's an art form called papel picado, which is a punched paper cutout banner, and it's very popular there, and people decorate their homes or businesses with them. And there's another art form called cartoneria, which is also for the Day of the Dead, using paper mache and cardboard tubing to make sculpture. Particularly, you may have seen the skeletal figures that are made with those. So in China, our originator of paper, there are things called jas papers, which are ceremonially burned during funerary and mourning times. I know I'm like throwing out a lot at you, but it's worldwide how the magnitude of what paper's role has become. And particularly in Japan, paper has been interwoven and has been very important. They've embraced paper in every aspect of their lives, with calligraphy, umbrellas, origami, which is a paper folding art, shoji, the translucent paper windows, that are Japanese. And there's also a material which I love to tell everyone about. It's incredible. It's called shifu, and what it is a piece of paper, mulberry paper specifically, that is cut into strips and then spun into a yarn and then woven into a cloth and made into garments. And that is made into kimonos and other things, particularly for ceremonies. So since the 600 AD, the Japanese have been ritually folding paper in terms of a prayer and an offering. And there's a story that I like to mention in terms of this concept of commemoration through paper. And it's the story of a young girl who was dying of radiation poisoning in Japan. And she set out to fold 1,000 paper cranes in the belief that she would heal herself. And cranes are symbolic in Japan of hope and of peace. And that practice continues today. Children in Japan make these paper cranes to honor that very sentiment of healing, especially during anniversaries of tragedy. So in order to consider the uses of paper, then you have to consider the quality of paper. And permanence and durability are the key qualities to making paper archival and having longevity. Permanence is the degree in which a paper will resist deterioration over time. And durability is the degree that it retains the original qualities during use. So for the potential for permanence, paper must exclude several things, one of which is ground wood fiber, and among other things, there's also residual bleaching chemicals, just to mention a couple. So with that in mind, you can consider the quality of our paper today as I enter into the process of making paper, which is, paper is essentially cellulose fiber plus water. And cellulose is a vegetable fiber. It's tasteless, odorless, white, non-volatile, insoluble in water. And the greater amount of cellulose that you have in a plant, the higher quality of paper that you will have. So cotton and linen, for example, have a higher cellulose content. They're nearly pure cellulose in their plant. So the preparation is very labor intensive. You have to access the cellulose of the fiber. And so you harvest it, you dry it, you cut it into strips, you cook it, you wash it, and then you beat it. And in the beating process of the paper, you're breaking down and multiplying the individual little fibrils within the cellulose fiber. At that point, your fiber is ready for the vat. And I have samples that we'll pass around of fibers in its form just before you beat it and cook it and beat it. So we'll pass those around for you to see. So once you've done that and you've multiplied all those little fibrils, you're ready for the vat, which is a big tub of water where the fibers are mixed with water and the atoms of the fiber bond with those in the water molecules. And then during the formation, which I'm going to demonstrate. Can I not done that? That's kind of funny. You guys can hear me, right? Okay. I should hope so. Okay, so what happens when you're forming paper, which primarily we form it in sheets. You take a screen, much like this, and you draw it through the vat of water, and I have in here the pulp and the water all suspended, and you pull it through, and when that happens, when the water drains, oh shoot, I did it upside down. I'll do that again. You didn't see that. Let's do that one more time. Okay. I thought it looked funny. Okay. All right. Now, I've brought in for this demonstration the biggest screen I had and the smallest vat I had in order to give a clear demonstration to you, but not to make the most beautiful paper. Normally, you would want a vat that's larger so that you can really move through it and the water can really participate in the process. Here, I have a lot of pulp and very little water, which is not the best ratio. But anyway, what happens is you've collected on top a thin stratum of cellulose fiber and water. And when the water drains through the screen, it pulls on the fibers and enmeshes them together, and the fibers create a new bond with one another. And so from this point, you would press it out and dry it. So, okay. So that's what happens in the actual paper process. So what's important then to see is that water is not only the vehicle, it's the medium that makes the paper. So paper is water in essence. In its erratic formation, the volume of water is significant to the minimal amount of pulp. And that's important to consider as I progress into this. So the industrial distinctions with fiber, or with paper, is that in the industry they use a tree fiber, which is not a pure cellulose. It contains lignin, which is a glue, and when that glue oxidizes, it browns the paper. And so in the industry they choose to use chlorine, which combats the lignin. And what is significant for me to consider in terms of making paper is if you chlorinate the vat of water, you can't continue to keep reusing that chlorinated water. That has to be flushed, and you need to keep using fresh water in order to not get too high of a concentration of the chlorine because it breaks down the fiber. So, in conclusion, through understanding the evolution of this incredibly practical, simple, and flexible material, we can recognize its potentials, and in its production, its use, its reuse, and discover creative solutions, or just recognize creative solutions to its use, and see alternatives to paper as well. So, on that note, I'll parlay over to... Sure.
Partly because we're filming and also so that everybody can hear. Can people see that okay? It's still kind of light in here, I think. But as Tony's doing that, I'll go ahead and get started. Tony's given you a brief introduction about paper's history and a little bit about paper making and the importance of paper to all of us. We all use so much paper that we don't have the luxury of making our own paper in an environmentally sensitive way. And that means that we have to buy paper that's been industrially produced. And what I want to talk to you about this morning is some of the consequences of industrial paper making. And Toni alluded to that a little bit with the chlorine that she mentioned. This is a picture of Stone Container, which is a pulp mill that's right here in the valley. And if you haven't signed up yet, I think we still have spots on our tour, which starts right after this at 10:30, where we're going to go down there and get a tour through the mill and get to see some of the equipment and hear about the paper making process that goes on there. So anybody who's interested, I'm sure will still be able to get a spot on that. As Toni said, if you simplify the paper recipe, the paper making recipe, it doesn't come down to too much. You have to have fiber in an industrial paper making. It's usually wood fiber, although there are other fibers like kanaf, or there's even paper now being made out of agricultural waste. Then the cooking process actually in the industrial process includes chemicals to dissolve the fiber. And the final step to make it white, as Toni said, to get the lignin out of there, you have to use something to bleach it so that it doesn't come out the color of a brown paper bag, which would be if you hadn't bleached it. They generally use chlorine. Chlorine has been really useful to the paper industry because it can take that lignin right out of the paper, out of the fibers real easily and make white paper cheaply for a huge variety of uses. Unfortunately, having chlorine in the process results in the production of thousands of toxic chlorinated chemicals, including dioxin. In fact, there are so many chemicals in the waste from pulp mills that they haven't even yet been able to characterize all of them, let alone find out, to even find out what they are, let alone find out how toxic they are. These chemicals end up in the air that comes out of pulp mills and also in the water. This is a portrait of dioxin. It's basically a couple of benzene rings, some chlorine molecules, and some oxygen. It has some close cousins called furans and also PCBs. PCBs aren't generally produced at pulp mills, but furans are. They're basically the same structure, except they have one less oxygen. And the chlorines can be positioned in different places around the molecule. If you don't know chemistry, you probably know what this means. Dioxin is one of the most toxic human-made chemicals ever known. It concentrates in fats, which is a problem in addition to its toxicity. That means that it moves up through the food chain and gets more and more concentrated at higher levels. It's also extremely persistent. Once it's in the environment, it takes a very, very long time to break down. It also takes a long time to break down once it's in our bodies. What I did here is put down some of the effects that have been found with dioxins. And when I say dioxins, I'm talking about both dioxins and furans. First of all, I want to just talk about how much dioxin is in our bodies. The EPA recently did a reassessment of dioxin to try to figure out what are the effects of dioxin, where is it in the environment, how much of a hazard is it. And they found out that the human population already has a very high level of dioxins in their body. It's not a high level in terms of concentration, because it's really just in parts per trillion, and that sounds really, really tiny, and it is. It's a part per trillion is a billionth of a gram. But as it turns out, this is at or near the level where you start to see effects, so it is a problem. This top red line here is the upper level estimate of what concentration of dioxins is, what the concentration of dioxins is in the general human population right now, and that's 50 parts per trillion. The lower level estimate is more like around 9, so it's somewhere within this range that probably all of us are experiencing dioxin contamination of our bodies. The lower line here is up to 150 parts per trillion, and that's for the upper 10% of the population. These are people that are eating food sources that are contaminated with dioxins or are otherwise exposed, say, in their job in industry. Now I want to compare these levels that we have in our bodies with levels that have been found to cause problems. At the very top here we have viral susceptibility increase, and that takes place at only 10 parts per trillion. So as you can see, even at the level that we're now exposed, we do have an increased susceptibility to viruses. The next two lines are learning disabilities. I know you guys can't read these. learning disabilities and decreased testosterone. These take place somewhere above 40 parts per trillion. The decreased testosterone was in humans. Not all of these are in humans. Some of these are from animal studies. The next two are sperm loss and endometriosis. These take place somewhere above 60 parts per trillion. Then diabetes and cancer take place when you get close to 100 parts per trillion. The diabetes and cancer are from humans. And these are not, the range on these is quite high. And what I put up was the lowest amount of dioxin that's ever been shown to cause these effects. So sometimes it takes a lot more, but this is where you start to see a problem. This is not only a problem for humans, but for animals, especially animals at the top of the food chain, as I mentioned, which actually is how we're getting our exposure to dioxins. Over 90% of our exposure to dioxins, and as I said, it's pretty high when you compare it to effects levels, comes from the food chain. The way this happens is that industry releases dioxins, it gets into the air, the water, and the soil, and then moves up through the food chain, as I said, getting more and more concentrated as it goes up the food chain. And guess who's at the top of the food chain? We're one of the top. This bioconcentration factor can be quite extreme. Fish can have hundreds of times, can have a dioxin level in their bodies that's hundreds of times more concentrated than the water that they're swimming in. So just testing the water doesn't tell you what you're going to find in the animals. It's very important to look at food chain effects. Fortunately, the answer to this problem is pretty easy when it comes to pulp mills, and that is to take the chlorine out of the process. Pulp mills are certainly not the only source of dioxins. When I was showing you dioxins that are in humans right now, I was showing you, that's from all sources, and pulp mills are definitely not the top source. The top source is incineration sources, but the thing about pulp mills is that the solution is already out there, it's being implemented, and that's just to take the chlorine out of the process. So it's the same basic recipe. You've still got your fiber. You can use the same chemicals for the cooking and dissolving of the fiber. And then you can either stop the bleaching process and make unbleached products. For instance, coffee filters, you don't have to have them white. It's okay to have them unbleached. Or you can add oxygen bleaching chemicals like hydrogen peroxide or ozone. And this makes what's called totally chlorine-free paper. Now I want to just talk to you about some of the terms that you're going to hear when people are talking about chlorine-free paper. It's not as simple as it seems like it should be. It seems like you could just say chlorine-free paper and you know what you're talking about, but unfortunately it's not that simple, so I'm going to try to educate you on that so that when you're out there making a choice of paper, you'll know what to look for. The first is totally chlorine-free paper, and this refers only to paper that's not recycled. So this is when they take wood fiber from trees or from plants that originally and bleach it without any chlorine chemicals. They have a different term when the paper is recycled, and that's processed chlorine-free, and that's because there could still be some chlorine in the fibers from the paper that you recycled. But basically the process doesn't use chlorine, so it doesn't release the dioxins. So that's a good choice. Now here's the tricky one. The industry has recognized that people are interested in chlorine-free paper. It's starting to get, the word's starting to get out that this is an important issue, and they've come up with this confusing term, which is elemental chlorine-free. And it still has the chlorine-free in there, so people get confused and think that this is the right thing. But unfortunately, all they're talking about is that it's elemental chlorine-free, and elemental chlorine is chlorine gas. They still use other forms of chlorine, like chlorine dioxide. So this is a bit of a problem with confusion, but you want to stay away from elemental chlorine-free if you're concerned about dioxins. The EPA recently, just a couple of weeks ago, made a new ruling on the technologies that pulp and paper mills have to use for their bleaching, and they ruled that elemental chlorine-free is what they can use. So at this point, chlorine gas will no longer be used because of the environmental hazards, but they're going to use elemental chlorine-free. This is a problem, as I said, because it still produces dioxins. It still has chlorine in the process. Some pulp mills hopefully will go beyond that, but it's going to take consumer pressure because they're not getting regulatory pressure at this point. Stone Container hasn't made a decision yet. about what process they're going to use. It's going to cost them a lot to just change to elemental chlorine free, and if you saw the paper this morning, which I didn't, I heard that they were announcing all the money that they're going to put into their process changes, but they didn't mention anything about taking the chlorine out of the process. As consumers, we have choices. As I said, we can be a part of causing this change since EPA and other regulators aren't going to take the chlorine out of the process for us. What we can do is send a message to paper makers every time we make a choice to buy a paper product. Today, household papers are widely available in unbleached, and that's a really good choice. Just take the whole bleaching process out of it. I mean, you can get bags, paper towels, napkins, even paper plates that are bleached without chlorine. When it comes to, I had these in the wrong order. When it comes to paper that you use around the house, these are also available right now. They cost a little more. There was a paper called Unity DP that a lot of people use, which was unbleached and was cheaper, and it just got taken off the market because there wasn't enough demand. So it's really important that we create that demand, and that'll bring the prices down. So it's a little bit of an inconvenience right now, but hopefully it'll get better. So just to summarize the easy points, I mean, this is a pretty simple presentation, but first of all, remember that when you have chlorine in the process, when it comes to paper making, you have dioxins. The best choices to reach for are unbleached, processed chlorine-free, and totally chlorine-free. So if you remember those terms, you'll be able to pick out the right paper. And the other thing to remember is that pretty water is, sorry, clean water is more than a pretty picture. Our waters need to be dioxin-free, and hopefully if we make choices as consumers for the right papers, we can push the industry to take the chlorine out of the process. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions for me or Toni, from anybody, since we still have a bit before.
Sunlight mine, as well as in a mine up by Cook City, Montana, at a very young age. And I was somewhat ingrained into the business. I was unlike most people in that when I went to school, I knew what I was going there for, or at least I thought I did. And that was to be a miner. I knew what it was all about and everything else. Now, one of the more interesting things about being a miner is you get to work in some rather beautiful places. As I said, when I was growing up, I got to work around Whitehall and then also up in the Cook City area. Later on, when I graduated from school, I worked not only in the U.S., but in other places like Canada, Alaska, South Africa, Central and South America, Russia, Kazakhstan. When you work in all these places and you start to see the effect, not only what happens here in mining, but in other places in the world in mining, to me it's pretty hard to ignore what mining does. Sure, it has some good things to it in terms of economics and other things, but everywhere it's been, it leaves a scar. And one of the things that happened to me over the 15 years I worked in the industry was I knew I was responsible in many cases for those scars that were left. I didn't work purely as a mine engineer. I also worked as a project manager at several mines in Nevada, also as a development engineer, and in the process of helping to develop a number of different mines. Mines such as the New World Project. I developed a study for that mine, and I think it was 1992, that I felt good about it because it tried to address some of the environmental problems. But one of the problems with that study was when I turned it into the company, which in turn was to turn that study into the EPA, and I think Lisa may talk about this kind of experience also. The company, instead of what I thought was a very logical conclusion and taking a look at the study and saying for $22 million we can solve our acid mine drainage problem, so therefore let's do it, instead turned around and said, can you inflate the cost of cleaning up the acid mine drainage problem so we can justify doing nothing at all with this study. Going into the study, my objective was to hopefully provide them a means of eliminating the problem. This was the type of thing that as a person working in the mining industry for many different years, I came to find as a problem. Over that 15-year period, as I said, I became a mine manager, had a very good position with a number of different companies. Received my professional engineering license from the state of Colorado and then recently from the state of Montana. But my one goal and what kept coming back to me is I wanted to move back to Montana. I'm from Montana, born and raised in the area. When I left in 1983, there were essentially no mines in the state. Mining was, to a large extent, dead. Sometimes I wish the economy and everything would have stayed that way. We wouldn't be dealing with all these issues we are today. But in leaving, I always thought I could come back as a miner. And I can tell you that I tried very hard to come back as a miner. I would interview for jobs, several times was offered jobs in the state of Montana, and for some reason, couldn't come back doing those jobs. I have to credit my wife with part of that. She's never quite been as blind as I was, at least, or was unwilling to put on the blinders as to what working for the mining industry was all about. But when it came time to finally make our minds up and say, we're coming back to Montana and we don't care how we're going to do it, we almost had to add on the end of that sentence that we're not going to do mining. Because when Pat talked about how water is connected to wilderness, et cetera, well, wilderness has always been a very big part of my life. Even as a mining engineer, I've always been a very strong wilderness supporter. And when you look at why you support things like wilderness, it is because of water, because of wildlife, because of aesthetics, because of the parts of what it brings to our lives. It, in fact, was that connection to wilderness that drew me to what I'm doing right now in the state of Montana and working as a technical advisor for conservation and environmental organizations. It was people who were working on wilderness when I went to talk with them about issues that I had who said, well, why aren't you working on these mining issues? And I said, well, maybe I can. And I didn't realize that when I first started working on I-122, just exactly what I was getting into, quite honestly. I quite naively didn't realize it was a mining or no mining type campaign. I really honestly believed, and maybe this is my weakness, but I think it's the strength that I'm hoping to offer people in what I'm trying to do now, is that there's an objective need to look at everything. We all need clean water. We all need the lifestyle that we value so much here. We all need these many things. And part of developing a Montana that we want to live in is looking at things objectively. So when I came back, I decided that I would try to find a little bit different way of making a living. Originally thought I'd do mine reclamation, wastewater treatment engineering. Now I find myself right back in the middle of mining. But that's what I want to talk about, a little bit of the strategy, a strategy that we're working on now. A lot of organizations in this state, I believe, have had a commitment for a number of years. Clark Fork Coalition, perhaps, Clark Fork Ponderay Coalition, perhaps being one of the leaders in this. And that's trying to take a look at projects on a technical basis. Too often, I shouldn't say too often, but I think we're often forced to frame our argument as stop the mine. But we don't spend enough time on saying why we need to stop that mine. And a lot of times, even when we do say why, it's based upon what many people view as purely emotional issues. I'm not saying those emotional issues aren't right or wrong, but unfortunately the process that we are forced to work with, which is part of the National Environmental Policy Act and the other permitting processes, they are not designed to take into account those emotional arguments. It's an attempt in a bureaucratic way to try to take into account scientific, technical, or an engineering type argument. As a result, it really only ends up doing one thing, and that's normally justifying the mine. Well, what organizations like Clark Fork Ponderay Coalition, TU, and some others in this state, and I might say that this state is really the state that's leading the way, and the environmental coalitions in the state, they've been countering some of this that's been going on by providing a more technical assessment of what's happening. Now, I didn't appreciate how important that was, and I'm not sure it was so important as it's beginning to be now, because when we first set up, or first looked at NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, it was intended to, I believe the intent was to provide objectivity in evaluating these programs or projects, if you will, that are being proposed, be they mines, power plants, hydroelectric facilities, et cetera. Unfortunately, I think when you take a look at the Department of Environmental Quality, In Montana, as we now know it, there's no objectivity there whatsoever. And in fact, many of the basic tenets, such as hiring independent contractors to develop an environmental impact statement, there's no such thing even as an independent contractor anymore. I'm not going to say that in all cases, but in many cases, that independent contractor status no longer exists. There's no objectivity in terms of looking at the whole picture, but rather what does the mine need to present to the public to get the permit and get this thing going. Well, let me tell you, folks, there's a whole lot more to it, as I think you all know, than what the mining company has to say about it, or for that matter, what the Department of Environmental Quality, particularly in the state of Montana, has to say about it. And so one of our strategies, and I think it's a very good one and a very valuable one, is to make sure that the public knows the other sides of the argument, that the public knows the facts, that the agencies have to pay attention to the arguments for as well as against the mine, that they have to produce a document that at the end of the day satisfies the requirements under NEPA and looks at the various alternatives. You know, we ran into kind of a funny situation last Wednesday night in Lincoln. We had the luck, or I don't know what you'd really call it, of having one of the local mine experts, whereas John likes to say one of the local mine economics experts and historians and everything else. But anyway, one of their people was at the mine. And this is kind of give you an example of, I guess a blatant example of how the mine would, and the agencies would have us frame this whole discussion. Somehow in the context of the discussion, it came up that we were talking about leakage of cyanide from the liner system. And to my way of thinking, there's no question, in fact, anybody's way of thinking, liners leak. It's, you know, we've talked about that here today at various times, but there hasn't been a mine yet that used cyanide that didn't leak some cyanide. So I rather off the cuff made the statement that the mine had submitted a design that was going to result in leaks and therefore pollution to groundwater. Well, the mine said, oh, no, we have not designed a system that will leak. That's not our intent at all. I said, but it will, so therefore you did design it. Well, it ended up that we had to change the structure of the sentence to get them to agree that we didn't design it to leak, but it will. Well, that unfortunately is the kind of thing that we're being faced with all the time, is the mine is not designed to pollute the water, but it will. The mine is not designed to have an economic impact in a negative manner upon the area of Lincoln, but it will. The mine is going to do a lot of things, and we're being given a process that kind of sanitizes it for us. Tells us that the engineers have looked at it, and to the best reasonable knowledge that they have, it's not going to be a problem. It doesn't tell us about the problems that it will create, and anybody who's naive enough to believe that there will be no problems, they're just plain wrong. But we need to counter that within the process. Now we have opportunities that I think are very unique that we're creating as a part of that. We've inserted ourselves into the EIS process about 18 months ahead of schedule. Normally when the draft environmental impact statement comes out, that's when we get our chance to start working on this. We're not waiting. We're going ahead and trying to influence in whatever ways we can the process itself by commenting on the alternatives development, also talking to the agency people, talking to the contractors who are working on it, any way we can to make sure that they do their job and look at this thing objectively. We're also talking to various other groups such as the State Land Board and others in an attempt to make sure that they also not just have what is our say, but can see the whole picture, and we can aid them in deciding for themselves. I think one other thing that we need to do and we need to work on, and this is what I think we want to make sure most of you know, is that we're also here to provide you with information. If you have questions about what company is saying, what the other side of the coin may be, it's not really an attempt to sway you one way or another as much as to make sure you are fully informed and you know what the facts are. Also, we'd like to assist you in providing that information or providing your perspective on it to the agencies, to the politicians, as well as help us in spreading it to the general public. So with that said, that's kind of the strategy I have to share with you.
Well, I'm next in line, and my name is Lisa Fairman, and I work with a company called OEA Research, and we're based out of Helena. And my background is I'm a wildlife biologist and a forester. I have 2 degrees from the University of Montana here. And my involvement in mining and wildlife stems from pretty much my involvement with the Asarco Rock Creek project. I was involved in writing portions of the draft EIS and the draft biological evaluation for that project. And so when I was thinking about what I should prepare for today, I thought, geez, there's a ton of stuff I could talk about regarding wildlife resources and mining issues. And I decided to focus on what I feel would be some perhaps helpful aspects for you as reviewers of an EIS or an evaluation, some helpful things for you to consider when you read these evaluations and these EISs. And perhaps from my experience as a biologist working on the Asarco Rock Creek project. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is any time a project has to do with wildlife, the natural environment, it's absolutely essential that the people that are analyzing the impacts or whatever go out on the ground. There's a lot of times as people get really, really busy, agency people, private consultants, whatever, it's really hard sometimes to find the time to go out on the ground and walk the land and become familiar with that space you're dealing with. And I think that's absolutely critical to understand what's going on. So look for that. Look to see if people have actually gone out on the ground. Yourselves, go out there and look on the ground and get a feel for what's going on before evaluating something. Or population numbers. Models can be very useful tools. They can also be inappropriately applied. I would recommend when evaluating something like an EIS or impacts to wildlife or whatever, is to look at those models that are being used in that evaluation process. Look at the assumptions that are built into those models. Sometimes assumptions, essentially modeling, you can do whatever you want as long as you have the assumptions down. Within reason, of course. But assumptions sometimes get a little stretched out and perhaps carried too far. Tied into that is the databases that are being used to draw that information from. Sometimes there just isn't the information in those databases, and people so often want to be able to put a number on something that they'll try to use the best information they can, but practically it's just not appropriate sometimes. So in evaluating these EISs or any document like this, look at the models that are being used. I was just meeting with some Fish, Wildlife, and Parks people the other day, trying to get a handle on what the lynx population in Montana is. And this is just an example of perhaps how a model is inappropriately applied. In that case, this individual told me, well, yeah, I came up with this population number for lynx, and essentially how I did that was I took all the lands that are considered montane forests. That's pretty much, if you look at a map of Montana, that's anything that's green. I mean, that's a lot of land. And from that then, he divided into that the average home range size of a lynx, of a female lynx. So you got this huge land base divided by the square miles of home range for a lynx, and you come up with a population number of lynx in Montana. Well, if we were to do that with black-footed ferrets, we would have a lot of black-footed ferrets in Montana. But the practicality is that's not the only thing that goes on with these issues. So that's one aspect of looking at a biological evaluation, is to look at those models and look at how people are using that data, how biologists or researchers are using that data. Another aspect I would like to cover is the analysis process. And one thing I'd like to add right now is if you have any questions, please interrupt me, ask me for clarification or whatever. Another process I'd like to talk about is the analysis process. Under various laws, some of which Jim has talked about, such as NEPA, Endangered Species Act, so we as being a biologist or an agency, are required to look at the direct, indirect, and cumulative effects of a proposed project. And